Hi everybody, and welcome to the Explore.org Polar Bear Cam live chat. Thanks for joining us again today. As you can see, we've got really subarctic things going on right now. We've got some wind coming in. It was so clear and calm and nice this morning, but we have some wind and maybe a little storm coming in. But we'll go inside in a little bit. We'll do a little intro out here as long as we can handle it. I'm your host, Alysa McCall with Polar Bears International, and again, my guest today is Dr. Jeff York, Senior Director of Conservation at PBI. We're really happy to have him here today. And our theme today is stressed out polar bears, but I don't want you to get like negative feelings about the theme. Basically, we just want to talk about how we know that polar bears are being impacted by changes and, what does cause them stress. We do know a little bit about it. We'd like to know more, but we can talk about that a bit today. So, how you feeling? Do you want to go inside, or are we good out here right now?
We're good for a little
bit. We're good? It's not too bad yet. Okay. So maybe one thing I can talk about first, and then we'll get Jeff to talk about a few things he knows about, is cortisol. So we do some cortisol studies with polar bears. We can do this in zoos or in the wild. And what cortisol is it's a corticosteroid hormone. That's the main stress hormone in most mammals, and even humans have cortisol. And we can measure levels of cortisol in animals, and it gives us an idea of how stressed out they are. So we have more cortisol when we're more stressed out. There's a couple of ways we can do it in polar bears. In zoo bears, we've looked at taking urine samples, and that's a bit of a more immediate stress. So are they stressed right now, or if something happens? But if we want to look over the longer term, we can take a fur sample. Now, hair and fur actually holds on cortisol in it. So even my own hair, if I pulled a hair right now, you could probably see when I went to grad school, when I was on vacation, maybe things like that, how stressed I was. And we can do that with polar bears too. So when we're in the field, we can take a little shaving of polar bear fur, and we can send it into a lab and have it analyzed, and they can break down the amount of stress that bear is feeling. And we know that this is very variable because of a few factors. So the age of a bear will affect its stress. The sex of a bear will affect its stress. So for example, older males generally will have less stress than juvenile males who have more. And females with cubs will sometimes experience more stress as well. So things like that definitely play a role. We've also been able to link, we have some people going by waving at the camera, so we'll link back to that. We've also been able to link these things, the stress hormone, to large climate events. So, for example, the North Atlantic Oscillation. This is a large climate event. It's a long-term fluctuation of the climate, and we can actually see that polar bear stress hormone is related to these large-scale climate events. So because we know that this hormone is linked to climate, we can predict that perhaps if climate starts fluctuating more wildly, as we expect, then there will be more fluctuations in polar bear stress hormone. So it's really interesting for us to look at that. We actually have a study right now going on these polar bears to look at the cortisol levels that they've had. So we have fur samples that we've had for quite a while now, and we have current fur samples, and we're analyzing all of those, and we want to look at how stressed the Western Hudson Bay polar bears are. And so we will get back to you with that information. Hopefully it comes out next year. We have a graduate student at the University of Alberta named Patrick Mislin working on that, and he's doing a great job so far. It'll be really interesting. But cortisol isn't the only way we know that polar bears are feeling these effects. Jeff, you also know of a few reasons that we know.
Sure, and I'll just add, another thing we're looking at with cortisol is bears in captivity. And captive bears can give us information we just can't get in the wild. And a great example of that is cortisol levels in blood. So if we're out in the field and we're catching an animal to put a collar on, to take samples and measurements, that whole process of catching the bear and also putting the bear under sedation changes some of the bear's physiology and also some of the parameters in their blood system in real time. So if a bear in captivity can be trained to allow blood samples to be collected without sedation, we can learn a lot more about what's going on with bears, sort of baseline conditions. So those captive elements can be a key part of this bigger story too, and ties in nicely with the work being done here in the wild. But there are definitely other ways we can look at stress. Two classic ones that are related are changes in behavior. And so those can be visual changes. Norwegian Polar Institute, some of our research colleagues, Magnus Anderson and Jan Ars, did a study on snowmobiles and stress of bears and looked at response distances in Svalbard, where they have quite a bit of snowmobile, snow machine tourism there, and we're able to measure and see kind of a pretty wide variation there among individual bears across age and sex classes of how much they were concerned. Some bears were less concerned, some bears were quite concerned and would move off far away. At a broader scale, you can look at behavioral changes by looking at changes in movements. And this is information we get through the collared bears. So bears that we put satellite collars on, we track throughout the year. We can say, are we seeing sort of large-scale changes in habitat use and movements that might be directly related to changes in habitat and these physical stressors on bears?
Mm-hmm. And it's not just polar bears that feel stress. Every animal, especially in the wild, has some sort of stress. And even if everything was perfect climate-wise for polar bears, they would also have some sort of stress. Where are they getting their next meal? Where are they finding their next mate? How am I going to raise my babies? Pretty basic things. But we're able to measure the baseline and then, hopefully understand when that stress level rises and see if, the correlations from what's going on in the wild. So it's pretty interesting stuff. Scientists are, very interested in how polar bears are feeling about these things. Well, feeling's the wrong word, but how their bodies are reacting. Maybe,
and that's a great point, because there is natural variation. There are good years and there are bad years. Even in the best of times when we had great sea ice, there were still bad years. We've had poor years in this region because of too cold conditions, if you will. So we had really heavy sea ice, which didn't allow polar bears to feed, and looking back historically. So separating out that natural stress from potential human-caused stress, whether it be from climate, whether it be from other human activities. Another kind of area of stress that we see is that of increasing human activity. So as the sea ice pulls back, as we open up this new ocean, people want to go up and research, they want to see, they want to explore, and in some cases they want to exploit resources in these areas. And at what point does this new activity start to add enough stress to wildlife and polar bears in particular that it's measurable, that it has a negative impact? And that's something that we sort of broadly call cumulative impacts, and it's really tough to get a handle on cumulative impacts.
Right. And one of the groups that might feel it quite strongly, these impacts, are the really young ones, so the cubs and mothers with cubs. And we did have a question already earlier come in, wanting to know, when and where are the cubs born, what's the mortality rate, things like that are, kind of part of this discussion. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Sure. So just, polar bear 101 reproductive cycle. Polar bears have generally a 3-year reproductive cycle where females, and they start to come into reproductive age around 5 to 6 in the wild. Breeding males tend to be, closer to 10 plus before they're mature enough to successfully compete for mates. The breeding will happen in the springtime, so say late April through early June time, bears are looking to find mates and to breed. Females that are pregnant have what we call delayed implantation, so that fertilized egg will be just floating across the summertime until she makes a sort of a physiologic decision, her body does, that says, yep, we're good to go condition-wise and we're ready to try for a reproductive event or a full pregnancy, and that egg will implant and she'll come looking for a den. Here in Churchill, in Hudson Bay, they come to shore around July and they go inland and dig into peat or pulsive formations and actually have earthen dens. And most of the rest of the Arctic, bears will come near shore. They'll find coastal bluffs, river bluffs, places that snow collects, and they'll dig snow dens, like a snow cave. And that's where they'll have their young. Those cubs will emerge in sort of the, again, say late March to April timeframe. It depends a bit on the geography on where they are as to when they come out.
Here it's a bit more late February, early March. That's a bit different.
And then as you get further north, it pushes back time-wise. And they'll, when they're first born, they're about 1 to 2 kilos. And when they pop out of their dens, when they emerge with their mom, they'll be 15 to 25 pounds.
They grow pretty fast.
They grow super fast.
Yeah. Mom's milk is very, very fatty for them. And do we know much about the mortality rate? It's pretty dependent on a lot of factors.
It depends a lot on the region and the year. So in some of the best of times, and I'll speak specifically to Beaufort Sea data, we are seeing survival rates upwards of 60% historically. More recent analyses done in around 2006, published by Regier and other scientists from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, showed that it declined down to around 42% in the Beaufort Sea. And there's another even more updated analysis that'll be coming out in the next couple of months. It'll be interesting to see what it says.
Absolutely. Yeah, it would have a lot to do with the year in particular, and of course, even the mother's age and her experience, and of course, the overall factors.
Definitely.
For that too.
Yeah.
Well, that's great. Well, maybe it's time to move inside so I can get my iPad and get your questions. Like we said yesterday, our iPad is struggling out here in these temperatures, so we got to move in to get all the new questions. So we'll move in here. We had a lot of bears this morning, but I think they feel the storm coming in. They know when the weather's coming, and I think they're hunkering down. All right. There's buggy one. And Jeff, maybe while I'm getting these questions fired up, so we're talking about stress today, and we're talking about, you know, things that impact polar bears. Something that I think PBI and polar bear scientists really want people to know is that, you know, there is no doom and gloom for polar bears. They, you know, they don't need to go extinct. We don't expect that they'll go extinct for quite a while. If things continue as they are, and if we can change how things are going, then, I mean, it's going to be a success story. Can you talk a bit about how we can, you know, help save the sea ice and help polar bears?
Sure. Yeah, just to emphasize that again, when you look at the scientific literature, the papers that have been put out there, they don't say polar bears are going to go extinct by the end of this century. What they say very clearly is, as we're losing more and more sea ice, we'll have fewer bears in fewer places, and those bears that do make it through this bottleneck will be at higher risk of extinction as that habitat loss continues. And that only makes sense. If you take away the habitat from any species, you're going to see reductions in both range and in abundance. And with those smaller populations, they're much more susceptible to disease, to sort of unusual events. And that's what we're talking about with polar bears. And like Alysa said, the positive thing we have here is we can change the outcome. We know what the primary threat is. It's climate change. It's driven by our activities, primarily burning of fossil fuels in the south. And we can do things about that. We can put a tax on carbon, for instance. We can try to start to level the playing field in the energy world and shift to renewable sources, you know, worldwide, where we can do those things, whether it be solar, wind, water, what makes sense geographically. We can make changes in our own lives at a very personal level that do multiply up and make a big difference when we do it together, when our whole family does it, our whole town does it, and our whole nation does some of these actions, you know, whether it be using your car less or switching over to LED bulbs that use 1/5 of the power of a standard incandescent bulb. These are things that are pretty straightforward steps and can have a big outcome down the road and help kind of turn the tide on warming climate and loss of sea ice.
Absolutely. And I've seen some people in the comments talking about, you know, buying local or at least regional, which is fantastic. I mean, it supports your local economy. It's good for us to eat local foods. Plus, it's great if we're not shipping all our produce in from all over the world when we can help it. Things like that are really great. And thank you to everyone who took part in Polar Bear Week this last week. We had a great show of, you know, tweets and social stuff and videos from people. And, you know, we love to see that stuff all the time. So just because Polar Bear Week is over doesn't mean the polar bears are. They're still here. Okay, they're going to be on the cams for another couple weeks at least. Plus, you know, they'll be back next year. They're out on the sea ice all winter. PBI, I mean, we're going all year round. This is our, you know, the most exciting time of our year maybe, but We always love to hear what you guys are doing for polar bears, how you're interested in them, the actions you're taking in your community, especially any of you school kids, if you're doing school projects or, you know, trying to do a school initiative for recycling, anything like that, please let us know. We love that stuff. We'd love to talk about you. So keep us updated. Awesome. Okay, so we have a question of how much fat can a polar bear store? Like, how fat can a bear actually get? What's fat for a bear?
Fat for a bear, and I'll just say weight-wise. So a male bear in the springtime, and you know, again, most of my experiences handling bears in the Beaufort Sea of Alaska or Chukchi Sea, we can see them as lean. These are adult bears, as say 500, 600 pounds. Those bears will double in weight over the course of the spring and summer to be 1,1300 plus pound bears. So you see a tremendous storage of fat in those animals. And you see the same thing in females, especially females that are pregnant and likely to den, where their weights will double and almost half again as much there. You know, large pregnant female could be pushing upwards of 800 to 900 pounds, so they can be quite large, considerable fat deposits there. But you got to think, in a place like Churchill, they're coming ashore in July and they won't be back out on the ice until March, late February, March.
Yeah, the pregnant females. Yeah, they go for up to 8 months without eating, so they really need. Sometimes pregnant females might look like they're wearing a pair of fat pajamas. Like, you can tell at the front they're a bear, and then they just have this incredible fatty layer over them, and it's super interesting to see. And they'll have a couple inches of fat at least, won't they?
Yeah.
Several inches. Yeah, so there's quite a thick store there. This is a really interesting question. So, do you think that polar bears have emotions? Do you think they get sad or mad about not eating? Interesting.
Do I think they have emotions? I think they do. And the occasions I've seen that, you have to be careful not to anthropomorphize, not to convey how we sense and see the world to the wildlife. And I've seen what, I mean, by all appearances, looks like mourning. These bears don't get up and leave, they don't get up and walk away. In the one case, it was a female who was incredibly skinny, and she needed to get out on the ice and hunt. The ice was coming in, it was about 2 weeks later in the year from now here on Hudson Bay, and she stayed with those two deceased cubs for days, when there was no logical reason for her to do that. So I have seen that. Conversely, I've seen bears, or signs of bears out on the ice where they were clearly playing. Young cubs climbing up on a pressure ridge and sliding down. Climbing up, sliding down. You know, were they smiling and yelling "wee" when they came down? Well, we weren't there, but just to see that evidence like you would with a river otter sliding down, it suggests that these animals are capable of play and may experience, you know, something akin to emotion.
Right. Yeah, and they're just such intelligent animals. You got to think there's a lot going on upstairs, and I mean, as humans and as scientists, we can't say really for sure, especially at this point. But I think it's dangerous to assume that there's, you know, no thoughts or feelings going on there. Absolutely. And even this morning, we saw a lot of play activity. There's a couple buddies out here, and they've been, you know, they're partners in crime right now. They're walking around, checking out things together. They're getting up under the lodge, sniffing things out. They're pretty funny. Once in a while, they'll kind of stop and roll around. So we kind of thought like there's a chance they might be related or just recognize each other from last year. It's hard to say, but it seems like they definitely have some sort of polar bear friendship or bond going on anyway.
Yep, there's definitely some social cohesion you'll see in bears in places like this where they congregate. It's really neat, and we're just beginning to understand what that might mean.
Very interesting stuff. Okay, so we have a question from Jane that says, besides a change in the condition of polar bears, are you seeing changes in other Arctic animals?
Yes, we are. A great example, and it's directly relates to polar bears, is in Svalbard. Some colleagues there, Kit Kovacs and Christian Leiterson, who study pinnipeds and whales, seals and whales in that region. And several of their study areas on the western side of the island, they've had, I think it's been about since 2005, 2006, almost complete reproductive failure of ring seals. in these areas they've been studying. And so they're just expecting to see what that means in a population sense around this year. You know, with these longer-lived animals, it takes a while. Populations can sort of be stable, even though you're not getting what we call recruitment, young animals making it to adulthood, until some of those older animals start to pass away, and then you can see fairly precipitous declines in population size. Another example, more North American, is influx of red fox into the north. So we're seeing more and more red fox. In Alaska, they tend to outcompete Arctic fox, and this has definitely been the case in northern Scandinavia and Sweden, where they're really concerned now that red fox could drive Arctic fox completely out of parts of northern Sweden if action's not taken there. So we are seeing impacts on other species in the north.
And it's so, maybe we should mention too just how hard it is to do research in the north. So it's amazing that we know these things. And I mean, Arctic research, we're expanding every year and we're learning so much, but it is hard to really get a great idea of what's going on in the Arctic. So we're getting better every year, but it's, well, first of all, Dick, I think, you know, flying up north in Canada even, I could probably fly around the world for the same amount of money. And it's the same for researchers, of course, getting your gear up there, setting up a research project. A lot of times some research is weather dependent. So for example, if you need to use helicopters, which a lot of us do when we're out there looking at sea ice or things on the sea ice, it's really tough stuff.
Yeah, to put it in economic terms, several of us kind of compared notes and estimated costs in the polar bear world. And so here in Churchill, and it'd be similar in Ontario for southern Hudson Bay, it's one of the least expensive places to do polar bear capture work, and it runs about, you know, say $1,500 per bear capture event to do that. You move to Alaska and to the Beaufort Sea in Canada, and you can double that. You're looking at $3,000 to $5,000 per bear, depending on where you move to the Chukchi Sea and the Canadian High Arctic, and you double it again. You're looking at much closer to $10,000 per bear. To capture and handle and obtain those samples. So it's really tough. We're limited. Really restrict Arctic research, you know, and despite some of the changes we have, the Arctic is still a remote place, and infrastructure in most countries is still really lacking.
Yeah, it's not easy being an Arctic researcher, but it sure is fun. Sure is fun. Okay, so Joe Bear has a question. Can it ever get too cold for a polar bear?
Polar bears, I mean, to them this is normal, right? They're just starting to enjoy life again. The summer, if anything, was probably much too warm for them. So one thing we clearly see in places like Hudson Bay, we see the same on Wrangel Island from our colleagues that observe bears there, is as the temperatures drop this time of year, bears become much more active. They start moving around. You start to see behavior like we did today, especially male sparring, males playing with each other. And it's like they feel it's okay to start burning off some calories again, because they know pretty soon here, any day, there's going to be enough ice for them to head out and start hunting again. And so, you know, bitter cold days with storms, bears will hunker down. They'll get out of the wind. They'll even let snow drift over them. If it's a longer blow, it could be sort of a den-like structure by the time it's all said and done, where they're drifted over and kind of dig around themselves. So they do get out of the worst of it. But you have to realize they're out year-round. They're not like other North American bear species that hibernate. They stay out on the ice, whether they be yearlings, 2-year-olds, or adult bears. They're out there trying to make a living year-round.
Sure like the cold. You can. It was cute today too. Maybe we shouldn't say cute, but it was just how they're. A lot of them are almost rubbing their faces in the snow, and they're digging the snow with their noses, and they're just getting their faces covered. They seem to really be reveling in the new snow cover out here. So it's pretty nice to see that, especially after we saw weeks of, you know, just kind of tundra and regular dirt and some dirty bears. Yeah, very warm weather. Okay, so we have a question from Bear Happy that says, do polar bears shed their foot pads like black and brown bears do? And if so, when, since most of them do not den? Interesting.
Do polar bears shed their foot pads? I honestly don't know the answer to that question. To my knowledge, I don't think they
I've
do.
never heard anything about that. Yeah. That's a great question.
We'll have to get back to you on that.
Yeah, they do have very interesting foot pads.
They do.
Very grippy for the sea ice. Scent glands
Yep.
in there.
Sort of little papillae on the bottoms that help them hold on to ice better and grip. But as to whether they lose their foot pads, we'll have to get back to you.
Cool stuff. Very neat stuff. Okay, so we have another question about the sparring. So people are asking, is it always the males that spar? Are females ever involved? There are a few females around here right now. Would they ever kind of get into it, especially with a male or with another female?
Sparring describes sort of this play activity that we see this time of year and in congregation areas. Again, mostly like here and in Svalbard, or in, not Svalbard, on Wrangel Island in Russia. And it's believed to be a way for males to both practice the fighting they'll do for real in the spring during breeding season, but potentially it may also allow them to establish hierarchies on shore now at very low risk that they'll remember when these same bears meet up out on the ice. We don't know that for sure. It's just one of several thoughts. Females definitely get involved in the action when it comes to real fights, when it comes to defending their cubs, when it comes to defending their food, and during breeding season when they're not that interested in added attention from male bears. I've definitely seen it in the field where female will put some serious licks on a much larger male bear who's showing unwanted attention. So they're quite capable, but we don't see them do it in a play form, which is interesting.
That is interesting. And now, do you think a polar bear, what would happen if a polar bear and a grizzly bear came together? Would there be a fight? Would one just ignore the other one?
It depends.
Okay.
Like so many things, it depends.
Depends.
We have some great observations of that in Alaska. So a couple of observations were in the oil field area of Prudhoe Bay, and it was around a landfill at the time. I think it was back when these things were open. We just weren't as good at taking care of our waste as we are today. And they saw both outcomes. They saw brown bear family group and a polar bear family group where the polar bears left. One year they saw the exact opposite the next year. To me, an interesting one is observations from colleagues in Kaktovik, where they have remains from bowhead subsistence harvests near a community in the northeast corner of the state of Alaska. And so polar bears have figured this out. And any given year, they'll have anywhere from 30 to 70 plus bears right around town and taking advantage of these bowhead whale remains there. Well, brown bears figured it out too in recent years, and colleagues there have seen these little barren ground grizzly bears, and they are the smallest of the brown bears, go running in to a pile of polar bears feeding, and all the polar bears scatter like polar bear bowling, and the brown bear stays. And the explanation that we have for that is polar bears are fairly risk averse. In this case, there's plenty of food. They're very well fed, and they just say, okay, you're a bear. We'll come back later.
Not worth it.
Not worth it.
Interesting. So we have a question about some of the field work that we do. Has a polar bear ever woken up while you're working on it?
No. Well, no. No and yes. We like to use it is it's very safe for the bear. It's relatively safe for people handling it, and it's very predictable. And so it allows us a very nice margin of safety in handling the bears, where we typically have a good hour and a half of time where the bear is in a very relaxed state and easy to work on. Now, as bears start to come around after that hour, and it depends, some years there might be more sampling done. Some bears do react a little differently than others and metabolize the drug a little bit more quickly. They can start to get neck movement. You'll see them start to follow you with their eyes, and ultimately they can start to push themselves up on their forepaws. And usually that's a pretty good sign it's time for us to leave.
Yeah, no kidding. Okay, so we have a question from Cog that says, how long do the GPS collars last, and can you retrieve them for later use, as happens in some other wildlife studies? How much do they cost?
Sure. So the collars, it depends on how they're programmed as to how long they last. If you're interested in really fine scale data, fine scale movements, nowadays we're putting more and more sensors on some of these collars, looking at things like saltwater immersion or higher end accelerometers, things like that. If you want fine scale data, what that means is the collars have to talk to the satellites frequently to get you that information, and that's going to drain the battery life. So collars could live as short as 6 months to a year. If you expand out that time and say, well, I only need movements every week, and I only need movements for the last 3 days every week, then you could look at getting 2 years, maybe 2.5 years if you really stretch that. So it depends on how you program them and what kind of data you're interested in. The collars we use can be rebuilt, and that saves a lot of money. Standard cost of a full GPS collar today with all the bells and whistles and an auto release, you're probably looking at $5,000 to $6,000 US dollars for that. So they're quite expensive, but we get a ton of data from them on movements and behavior. Again, because of some of these new bells and whistles, we're getting more information from them than we ever have. So the changes in technology are super promising. Battery life's getting better. Collar size is getting smaller. It's just like our cell phones and other things. Every year these things improve. So it'll be neat to see in 5 years what new grad students are telling us about polar bear movements and behavior.
Yeah, it's such interesting data.
Yeah.
Yeah, really, really cool. And we get pretty excited when we can retrieve a collar, because we will try to retrieve collars that drop on land, but we think quite often they'll drop on the sea ice. Maybe there's probably a few lying on the bottom of Hudson Bay, I think. So, but we usually retrieve at least 1 or 2 every year and get them rebuilt, and that does save us some money. So.
Yeah, we just tried to get one of Alysa's collars back this year when we were out on the coastal survey and went to the location. We were hovering over sort of this muskeg, and it was clearly there, but underwater. Maybe this much water, but it's frozen, and we weren't able to get it yet. So they'll have to go back and when it's thawed out and pull it out of the drink.
Maybe next time.
Maybe next time.
That'd be great. Okay, so we have a question from Katie that says, you were talking about stressed out polar bears. Have you seen any behavior today or yesterday that was a sign of stress?
Not really. Yeah.
The behavior stuff that we would see is more immediate, and the more hormonal stuff would be more long-term. One maybe sign of stress might be when they're yawning, and that's a pretty mild one, more like a displacement behavior, they're not sure. But probably, we did see some yawning today, but I think that guy was more interested in smelling us. He didn't seem too perturbed about anything.
Yeah. And on windy days like today, one thing you'll see every now and then is some of these, and they tend to be more younger bears, subadults or young adult bears that are highly curious of the buggies and checking them out and checking us out in them. If somebody doesn't grab the door quickly and it bangs shut or something, you'll see the bear start back. But that's a very short-term, sort of ephemeral response. But that's, in a sense, that's temporary stress, right? The bear jumped back. So
yeah, humans would do that too.
Yep.
Yeah, and once you realize it doesn't hurt, then maybe next time you're not as shocked. Yeah, interesting. Okay, and we have a question from Julie that says, when do you think the ice will be frozen enough for the polar bears to leave? It looks like there's a lot of ice out there.
There is a lot of ice out there now, and it's been amazing to watch. This is my 7th or 8th year being here on the bay, and it's like a switch is thrown. And boom, ice starts coming back. That water out there is never very warm, even in the summertime, so it's always sort of wanting to freeze, and it just needs the right conditions and these cold temperatures that we've been getting now. I think it was minus 19 C this morning when we woke up, so that's about 3 degrees Fahrenheit, which is perfect for the bears.
Right. And so right now there's not enough. Of course, the ice isn't extending very far, but it'll start along the land first, and pretty soon, again, sometimes it seems to happen almost overnight, you'll wake up and Hudson Bay will be frozen for as far as the eyes can see.
Yeah, if you look at a sea ice map now from, Environment Canada, you won't see much ice in the bay at all from a satellite. What we see out here, even though it looks like a lot of ice, is just intertidal. The slope here is incredibly shallow, and so you have this super shallow shelf that goes out hundreds of meters, literally. So you're talking about water that's, depending on the tide, maybe yay deep, and these ice blocks form. And right now the wind's coming from the north, and it's pushing what little ice in the bay is up against the shore, which is one of the reasons these bears are here. The winds are predominantly from the north. You have a lot of fresh water flowing out of the Churchill River just west of us, and that fresh water will put a lens on top of the salt water and it'll freeze faster. So it gives these bears a bit of a head start to get out and hunt seals.
Pretty neat. So we have a question from Bear Happy. Are there any invasive species in the Arctic that might affect the food chain? And could you talk about the difference between invasive species and the rule survival of the fittest?
Invasive species, when I think Arctic-wide, there's only one significant one that I know of, and it was actually put there by people on purpose. And that's king crab over in the Barents Sea that were placed there. They've been doing really well, but they're not native to that part of the Arctic, and there are definitely concerns about impacts they might have on native species. The thing we see more in the Arctic is basically range extensions of species that live just a little bit further south, kind of like the red fox I talked about earlier. We're seeing similar stories here in the marine environment where, here in Hudson Bay, we're seeing more harbor seals. We're seeing killer whales come in more often and chase the beluga whales and the seals. There in other parts of the Arctic, like Svalbard and the Barents Sea, they're seeing different whale species staying in the north longer. And they're seeing shifts and down to the planktonic community level. So in the past, you have on that side of the world a North Atlantic current that pushes up far into the north and keeps most of coastal Scandinavia much warmer than it otherwise would be. And that brings all sorts of juvenile sea life with it. So it brings plankton from the south, it brings eggs and larvae of a host of species that typically just don't make it. The water eventually becomes too cold, and those species, don't survive. Well, guess what? The water's warming, conditions are changing, and some of those species are making it now, and they're out competing the species that used to live there. So what we're typically seeing is more of a shift in speciation and sort of a range extension in the north.
Right, and that's that whole survival of the fittest sort of idea. If they can exploit the resources better and have a lot of offspring, then they will outcompete the local species over time, and we don't necessarily want that to happen.
Yeah, and I think that often gets kind of mixed in the storytelling is, with the changes we're seeing and expecting to come, it's not that nothing will be out here. There will still be life in the bay, there will still be life in the Arctic, it'll just be different. It won't be the Arctic species, it won't be the ice ecosystem that is the Arctic today.
Yeah, it changes. So we have a question from Martina about the radio collars. So has a bear ever managed to destroy one? And was a female that's been radio collared before going into den? Has a female that's been radio collared before going into den for giving birth? So have we been able to monitor females in the den? And do they ever destroy radio collars?
Yeah, I mean, as you might imagine, polar bears were among the hardest animals to successfully put. Initially, they were just VHF radio transmitters, and nowadays satellite collars. Because of their lifestyle, they're big, tough animals, and they live in this environment. They're in and out of salt water, freezing water, banging around on the ice, and temperatures down to minus 40 or lower. And so it was a real challenge to build something that could withstand that, especially over the course of a full year or longer. What we see most frequently, and I guess and we only collar females because male necks are too large. They're actually larger typically than their head, so they're sort of cone-shaped, and collars just fall off. So when we talk data, that's almost all from female bears. In recent years, we're just starting to crack the technology envelope where we can put either glue-on tags or small little satellite ear tags on males and subadults, but we're still chasing that technology, and not quite there yet. But as far as destroying collars, what we see more often is, well, when we go to put a collar on, we slide it on over the bear's head. So we don't strap it on and then tighten it down. We measure their necks, fit the collar, make adjustments, and then that's one of the last things we do before we leave is we'll slide the collar on, tuck it behind the ears, and put it there. We do that so they can take them off. And every now and then you catch a bear that just doesn't want to wear a collar. And so the next day you go to check her and there's the collar lying on the ice, next to where you caught her. Most bears do wear them, not unlike our pet dogs in a sense. They just seem to get used to them, and it doesn't seem to affect their behavior, doesn't affect their survival either. As far as tracking females to their dens, that's one of the reasons we wanted to get collars out to begin with, is to learn when and where bears den and why they choose certain areas. So that's been a key tool in our understanding of polar bear denning ecology for sure.
Absolutely, yeah. I've retrieved one collar before that fell off as it was programmed to do. And it did seem a little bit chewed on, but it actually looked like maybe a fox or something had come along and chewed on it. It probably had quite the smell stuck to it from the polar bear, and something took a bit of a, gnawed on it a while and left it alone. So, yeah.
And that's something we have seen with a few females coming out of their dens, is it's not the female that's bothering the collar, it's the cubs. And the cubs have this thing around mom's neck they can chew on, and they can do pretty good damage to a collar.
Might feel good on their teeth. Well, you see polar bears up here, sometimes we'll even see them chewing on an antler or a stick, kind of just like your dog would chew on something. So it's probably just maybe fun for them to chew on sometimes. I don't know. It's pretty funny. Okay, another question. Why do you do this work, and what inspires you and helps you to stay positive and hopeful?
Good question. I guess what inspires me is I just love the Arctic. I was fortunate enough when I first came to Alaska to land an Arctic biology job, within my second year that took me to the Beaufort Sea. And something about the place, the space, the feel of the Arctic just really got in me, and I never look back in that sense. And I still feel that way today when I'm in the north. I just feel comfortable and sort of at home in a sense there. The other part of the question.
How do you stay positive?
Oh, how do I stay positive? To me, that's easier, and I would say the work I've done the last 6 years, where I've been super fortunate to travel around to different parts of the world and meet with colleagues who are trying to conserve African elephants and Asian rhinos and tiger and mountain gorillas and marine turtles and freshwater dolphins and things like this. And when I hear their stories and when I see what they're dealing with, where they have a species that's in very low numbers and a highly fragmented habitat. Mountain gorillas to me are a classic example. They've been pushed onto these islands, these mountain islands in places like Rwanda and Uganda. They're surrounded by people. They have no place to go. We've taken up all their habitat, and now we've thrown in climate change on top of that, which is just pushing them in a sense higher and higher up these mountains. When I contrast that to the Arctic, yes, we have serious problems and huge challenges, but for us, they're challenges that are yet to come in many cases, particularly with climate. We're looking into the future and we're seeing the beginnings of these declines. We're kind of, seeing these trends that are happening, but today we still have polar bears across most of their historical range. Today we still have huge tracts of intact habitat, and to me the hopeful thing is looking at the lessons from other parts of the world where we haven't done things right. We've made mistakes, in North America and elsewhere on habitat management. We don't have to repeat those mistakes here. We can do better at protecting habitat today. We can do better at reducing all these other stressors from human activities and development and mitigating those now, not letting them get out of hand. And, as we talked about earlier, we can do something about the big one, climate change.
It's a hopeful message, and I think everyone, if we have just a little bit of respect for nature and the other animals in it, then I think that we can, extend our helping hand to all the other creatures that we share the earth with, really. And it only benefits us in the end, so.
Yeah.
Okay, so we have time for one more question before we wrap up. And that is, if you could ask each individual to do one thing to help the polar bears, what would it be?
I guess to me the one thing polar bear specific is reduce your carbon footprint in whatever way you can. We all can't take the same steps, but we can all take some steps. You know, there are many paths we can take to that goal there, whether it be things like driving less, carpooling more, riding your bike if you can, living closer to work if you can, to more expensive things like changing out, you know, when you need to replace bulbs and things with super efficient, you know, light bulbs, appliances, you know, and ramping that up even further if you can afford an electric car when it's time to replace your car, if you can afford a hybrid, if you can afford a high mileage car, if you can afford to start adopting renewable energy in your area. Those are all great things to do. And of course, we don't expect everyone to be able to do them all, but do what you can, and those small steps will add up.
Absolutely. And for me, I'll just add, if you're of age, then get out and vote for people that are, you know, making these big decisions. So let's vote for leaders that care about the environment and, you know, accept climate warming as the science shows. And let's just let our leaders know that it matters to us, and it matters to the future, and it matters to our future children and, you know, the next generations. This is really important stuff, and when leaders figure out that we're going to use our votes, they want to be in power, and we're going to put them in power, so let's put the right people in power, for sure.
Yeah, you look at the most recent IPCC data from hundreds of scientists that have incorporated literally tens of thousands of review comments. It is quite the piece of work. And I mean, to me, the two top line messages are climate warming is unequivocal, and that there's a 95% likelihood that we're to blame. Now, if somebody said to you, hey, you know, on your way to work today, there's a 95% chance you might get hit by a bus. You might not walk to work that day. So why would we behave differently in this case, where people are telling us that are very experienced from a number of disciplines, from hard science to biologists
Independent
to, you know,
people.
economists, that these things are happening, and we need to do something about it. So I'm hopeful we'll make those choices. I'm seeing signs that we are starting to shift in those directions, and you know, we just have a ways to go.
Absolutely. And again, just because Polar Bear Week is over doesn't mean the polar bears are gone. So keep watching, keep letting us know what you're doing for polar bears. We would still, you know, there's some great Save Our Sea Ice videos now up on YouTube that people made for polar bears. They're just fantastic, and we love all that stuff. So keep doing what you're doing. Keep letting us know the actions you're taking for polar bears. And with that, again, I would really love to thank Explore.org for helping with these camps and helping bring polar bears right to your homes all across the world. Thank you so much to Frontiers North Adventures, who donate Buggy One to Polar Bears International. Without them, we wouldn't have scientists and experts out here, and we wouldn't be able to bring these segments to you or bring polar bears to you. And also thank you to Parks Canada, who've helped host the Cape Churchill Cams in Wapusk National Park. Plus they do all sorts of other great things managing that park, and you can check out their website. There's a link to it on the Explore page. It's really, really neat stuff that goes on here. So, and of course, thank you to all of you for watching. You guys are so great, taking awesome snapshots, asking fantastic questions. Thank you so much. We're still going to be in the chat window all week. There's still going to be Tundra Connections webcast coming up. Our theme this week is Connecting Ecosystems. We have some awesome people here that will be putting on some great shows. So thank you so much, and have a great day.
Thanks.
Bye.